Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Alejandro Chetman, soy profesor de Derecho Internacional de la Escuela de Derecho de la Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas al segundo encuentro de Diálogos de Derecho Internacional de la Universidad Torcuato Di Tella en la edición 25 aniversario de la Escuela de Derecho. Me complace presentar muchísimo a nuestra oradora de hoy, Mónica Hakimi. Mónica va a hablar alrededor de 25 o 30 minutos y luego vamos a tener tiempo para preguntas. Quienes quieran hacer una pregunta, les pido por favor que lo hagan usando la función de chat. Pueden hacerla en inglés o en castellano. Si es en castellano, voy a traducir. Ahora voy a pasar a hablar en inglés. Welcome everyone. Welcome Mónica. It is a real pleasure to have you. As you all probably know, Mónica is James Campbell Professor of Law of the University of Michigan. She has also worked for several years in the U.S. States, experience in litigating international and domestic fora. She is a contributing editor of the Ideal Talk, which is a blog of and also a member of the board of editors of the American Society of International Law. Her work on the use of force, on sources, and on the fabric of international law are full of path-breaking contributions to contemporary debates. I think she's, without a doubt, one of the most innovative and interesting international lawyers working today. We are extremely delighted to have you, Mónica. Today her talk will be about Bellum. Mónica, thanks for coming. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. And thanks to all of you in the audience. I'm sorry that we can't gather in person, but I'm absolutely delighted to be here. My lecture today is about the jus ad bellum, the body of international law that governs when states may use force across national borders. The contemporary jus ad bellum stems from the UN Charter, and its basic structure is straightforward. Article 2.4 of the Charter prohibits states from using force, and I quote, against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. That language has long been understood to prohibit any use of force by one state in another without the latter state's consent. The Charter establishes only two exceptions. First, states may use force by going through the UN Security Council. Second, they may use force in, and again I'm quoting, individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs. But that's pretty much all the Charter says on the use of force. So while the Charter establishes the foundation for the jus ad bellum, it remains very bare bones. It leaves a lot of the law's content unsettled. And in the ordinary course, states and other global actors disagree about this content. They disagree about how to interpret particular UN Security Council resolutions that authorize states to use force. They disagree about whether, and if so when, the right to use force in self-defense is triggered by attacks that are committed by non-state groups or in anticipation of attacks that have not yet occurred. They disagree about whether states may ever use force outside the Council to avert a humanitarian crisis, and on and on. Now, most international lawyers, when they approach this body of law, try to resolve its normative content. This is especially true, I think, of academic international lawyers. There are many, many law review articles and books that try to establish the jus ad bellum's proper content, whether as a general matter or as applied in concrete incidents. I'm going to take a different approach in this lecture. I'm not going to try to establish this content. I'm going to take as a given what a lot of the legal practice shows, and that is that the jus ad bellum's content is, in the ordinary course, unclear, contested, and not authoritatively resolved. To be clear, I'm not saying that its content is entirely up for grabs. It's not. But disagreements about what it prescribes, and therefore about whether particular operations are compliant, are routine. Lawyers harness different methods and precedents to support their competing positions. And in the end, we don't have any kind of conclusive or authoritative determination of who is correct, or therefore what the law prescribes. So I'm going to take these contests about the jus ad bellum as a given, and then I'm going to do two things. First, I want to explain this aspect of the jus ad bellum, what I'd refer to as its argumentative dimension. Why does the jus ad bellum create so much space for argumentation and debate? And why do these arguments so often lack meaningful resolution? Second, I'll evaluate it. If in the ordinary course, we can't definitively say what the jus ad bellum prescribes, or therefore whether particular uses of force are lawful, what is the point of arguing about it? My normative claim is that the jus ad bellum's argumentative dimension is both valuable and underappreciated. And it is, in my view, newly at risk in the current political moment. Okay, so first, Why is the use of Bellum such an open textured body of law? The short answer is that states do not consistently advance, through their words and their deeds, the same vision of what it prescribes. And in this and in other areas of international law, the authority to establish its content is not centralized in any one place. Lots of analysts suggest otherwise. They contend that authority in the use of Bellum is in fact highly centralized, that it rests mostly with the Security Council. The claim is that the Council must participate as much as possible in use of force decisions, and that the exception for self-defense must therefore be very narrow. Remember, I'm not interested in defining the proper content of the law. I'm interested in describing how states and other actors engage with the law. And the hard fact is that states have not consistently taken the position that authority must be centralized as much as possible in the hands of the Council. To the contrary, they routinely battle over when and how the Council must participate in particular use of force decisions. So take the example of unauthorized humanitarian interventions. States as a group have repeatedly indicated that they would prefer for humanitarian crises to be dealt with through the Security Council. But the majority of states have not insisted on using the Council where it has stalled out. Many have instead tolerated or supported humanitarian interventions that have been conducted without the Council's authorization in the face of its inaction. This ambivalence about the Council's role has spawned a long-standing debate about the lawfulness of such interventions. Again, I don't want to take a position in that debate. I'm underscoring that whatever position one takes, the debate itself and the wishy-washy behavior that has generated it reveal that authority in the use of Bellum is not as settled or as centralized as the Council, as many suggest. It is unstable and contestable in specific cases. Or take the current debate about self-defense against non-state actors. The debate is, on its surface, about the use of Bellum's content, the scope of the right to act in self-defense. But the debate is also, and more fundamentally in my view, about the allocation of decision-making authority within the use of Bellum. The more expansively one defines the right of self-defense, the more authority shifts from the Council to individual states acting outside of it. Again, the persistence and intensity of the debate reveal that authority is not settled and centralized in the hands of the Council. It is openly contested. Now, the many contests about the use of Bellum's content are sometimes resolved. Although the Security Council does not have all the authority that is often ascribed to it, it remains the principal decision-making organ in the use of Bellum, and its pronouncements are regularly cited as evidence of positive law. Other international institutions also have authority to define the content of the use of Bellum. For example, the positions that the International Court of Justice has taken have been extremely influential. ICJ interpretations are widely taken to reflect positive law. International institutions thus play an important role in defining the use of Bellum's content. Their pronouncements establish the bounds within which most debates about the use of Bellum occur. But there are limits to what they can do. International institutions do not address every issue that arises in the use of Bellum. Their normative positions are often ambiguous or open to multiple conflicting interpretations. Even when their positions seem clear, states as a group might condone operations that deviate from them, raising questions about whether they reflect or still reflect positive law. And where an institution's authority is not formally established, it ultimately is contestable. For example, the United States has long rejected some of the ICJ's positions on the use of Bellum. The US claim is that these positions are not binding on or authoritative for it. And as a formal legal matter, it's not clear that that claim is wrong. Decisions relating to the use of Bellum are also made and appraised outside institutional settings through a decentralized process that is commonly associated with customary international law, but is also relevant to the interpretation and application of treaties, such as the UN Charter. This decentralized process is messy and disjointed, and authority within it is not centered in any one place. Authority is instead shared among the many uncoordinated participants, mostly 193 independent states. As a result, this process doesn't easily produce authoritative resolution. Again, this does not mean that everything goes, or that states may use the decentralized process to establish authority for whatever they want to do. Because authority ultimately rests with the collective, states that want it on their side must earn it from other participants in the process. They must establish that they have it in order for their conduct to be lawful. Making that showing is, of course, hard to do when a state clearly contravenes settled law. For example, the prohibition of forcible annexations of foreign territory is deeply entrenched in the use of Bellum, at least for now. A state that violates this prohibition is extremely unlikely to establish authority for its conduct through the decentralized decision-making process that I just mentioned. The state might claim that the conduct is lawful, but the claim is unlikely to resonate with other actors. Most will appreciate that the acting state just violated the law. The dynamic is different where there is a real contest about the law's content, which, remember, is not infrequent. During a normative contest, states routinely make ambiguous or contradictory legal arguments. Many stay silent on the law, use language that is opaque or non-committal on the law, or support operations that are inconsistent with the positions that they themselves have taken in other contexts. These discrepancies and ambiguities complicate efforts to resolve the legal issue in dispute. They suggest either that states have not collectively settled the law's content, or that any settlement remains highly contingent. For this reason, disagreements that play out mostly through the decentralized process, that is, without institutional support for one position or another, often lack authoritative resolution. And yet, states and other actors routinely have these disagreements. They argue about what the use of Bellum prescribes, even when their arguments do not, and could not reasonably be expected to, lead to authoritative resolution. As examples, I've already mentioned the debates on humanitarian interventions and self-defense against non-state actors. Another recent example concerns the NATO-led operation to depose Libya's longstanding leader, Muammar Gaddafi. The legal question was whether the regime change fell within the scope of the Security Council's authorization, specifically whether it was necessary, quote, to protect civilian and civilian-populated areas under threat of attack. States argued about, but ultimately did not resolve that question. Turning to my second normative question, what are we to make of this argumentative practice? Is there any value to it? If you think that the whole point of law is to establish conduct law norms that define what is appropriate and then to shape behavior in that direction, your instinctual answer will likely be no. The breadth and depth of the use of Bellum's argumentative dimension will seem dysfunctional. And it might in some sense be dysfunctional, but today I don't want to measure it against some abstract and unattainable ideal. I want to evaluate it on its own terms. My normative claim is that the use of Bellum's argumentative dimension does quite a bit of good, even when it does not lead to authoritative settlement and the law's content on the issue in dispute remains unresolved. Before I advance that claim, though, I should probably define what I mean by the argumentative dimension. Here, I'm drawing on a long line of legal and political philosophy about the defining qualities of legal argumentation. As all lawyers know, legal arguments, whether about the use of Bellum or otherwise, have a particular structure and style. Most fundamentally, they center on questions of authority. They focus not only on whether particular conduct is feasible, but also on whether it is appropriate, whether it is consonant with the precepts of the relevant group. Legal arguments offer reasons for positions that purport to reflect not just the speaker's own preferences, but the interests and values of the group. They tie the reasons to the facts. They rely on particular texts, norms, and methods of analysis, and so on. Arguments can be more or less legalized depending on the extent to which they display these qualities. But, and this is the point I really want to underscore, an argument need not use a derivation of the word law or invoke any particular text or norm to be legal in kind. What makes it legal in kind is its structure and style, and its particular focus on issues of public authority. Here's a concrete example. In 2017, the United States attacked a Syrian airfield after evidence surfaced that the Syrian regime had used chemical weapons against its people. The United States did not claim to be acting pursuant to the UN Security Council's authorization. It did not claim to be acting in self-defense, and it did not claim to be acting with the Syrian government's consent. Some analysts have taken this to mean that it therefore did not present a legal argument to justify the strike. I disagree. The United States, in fact, did try to justify its exercise of military power by reference to international law. In its words, Syria's, quote, widespread violations of international law. It invoked several international legal texts to argue that it was upholding not just its own priorities, but the interests and values of the international community as a whole. It alluded to background norms of behavior when it asserted that it used force only as a last resort, only after the, quote, exhaustion of all reasonably available peaceful remedies, and only as, quote, necessary and proportionate to the aim of deterring and preventing the future use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government. It also appeared before the Security Council, the international institution with legal primacy on the use of force, to explain its conduct and subject its reasoning to external scrutiny. In short, the United States conceded that it was not entitled to attack Syria just because it could. It recognized that any authority for its operation would have to come from other states, and it made a pitch to them to earn this authority. These are, in my view, the ingredients of a legal argument. We can contrast that approach with the one that the United States took earlier this year when it conducted a targeted airstrike against Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, who was at the time on business in Iraq. Soleimani commanded an Iranian military unit that supported armed groups throughout the Middle East, including in Iraq. He likely was involved in many incidents of low-level violence against the United States and its allies. Still, the US attack on him clearly upped the ante. In the days following the strike, the United States mostly just thumbed its nose at international law. President Trump and other administration officials vacillated incoherently about their justification for using military force. They variously suggested that the action was justifiable to deter imminent attacks that Soleimani was plotting, that it was retribution for earlier attacks, and that it was just part of a broader geopolitical contest with Iran. US officials did not provide the details to substantiate any of these justifications. At times, they also trafficked in conspiracy theories and lies. These two examples, Syria in 2017 and Soleimani in 2020, put in stark relief my normative claim. Putting aside the question of whether a particular operation is lawful, a question that will often, but not always, lack authoritative resolution, what's at stake in whether states use the resources of international law to argue about it? Here, I want to argue that legal argumentation promotes 4 values that are associated with the rule of law. First, and at the most basic level, legal argumentation signals that material power is not a sufficient basis for making governance decisions. Those who have the power to make particular decisions must show not only that they can implement a decision, but that they may, that they have authority to do what they want to do. In the use of Bellum, the relevant authority rests beyond the jurisdiction of any one state. Those who want it have to earn it from other global actors. When they argue about whether they have it, they indicate, even if only implicitly, that it exists and that it matters. It matters enough for them to fight over it. Arguments about the use of Bellum's content thus reinforce and preserve the expectation that use of force decisions must be rooted in some authority that resides at the international level. Note that authority works differently depending on whether the arguments are resolved. So in cases of settlement, the legal argument helps to confer authority on particular normative positions. For example, after Russia forcibly annexed Crimea in 2014, most members of the UN Security Council and General Assembly rejected its legal argument that it was advancing the Crimean people's right to self-determination. In doing so, they helped to establish the law's content for this case. Russia had acted unlawfully. Absent that kind of settlement, the authority that is generated through the argumentative practice might not attach to any one normative position. The different positions on the table are contested. The authority is instead systemic. It reinforces the general proposition that use of force issues are properly resolved, not by any one state, but by the group of them. That's why it matters that after the 2017 Syria strike, the United States at least recognized that any authority for its operation would have to come from other states. The United States thus made a case to other states for what it did. The US message in the Soleimani incident was different. It was that the United States would do as it pleased, and the rest of the world would suffer the consequences. The authority of international law was irrelevant. Second, legal argumentation serves to hold those who use force accountable for their actions. Because international legal authority rests with the collective, and states that want it on their side must earn it from other actors, arguing with them about whether they have it is a way of holding them accountable for their decisions. When a state seeks to establish its authority, when it makes a legal argument to support what it has done, it effectively empowers other actors either to confer authority on or to deny authority to it. The legal argument thus becomes a tool for legitimizing or delegitimizing the behavior in law. In some circumstances, legal argumentation might work to constrain whether or how a state exercises its military power. A state that cannot reasonably justify a use of force decision might choose to do something else. But no matter whether the legal argument affects a state's operational behavior, it is a way of holding the state's feet to the fire. The argument pushes the state to explain and try to justify the decision to the various external constituencies that are paying attention. The Soleimani strike is again instructive. Although Iran and Iraq each complained to the Security Council that the United States had acted unlawfully, the United States communicated through its evident disregard for the enterprise that it was not particularly invested in justifying its conduct in law. And the vast majority of other states did not press it to do so. The result was that the use of Bellum seemed not only materially, but also normatively irrelevant. It did not constrain the decision to use force, but neither did it serve to legitimize or delegitimize the action. By not having the legal argument, states did not hold the United States accountable for the strike. Third, legal argumentation is a way of showing respect to people who care about or are affected by particular decisions. The argument treats people like they are not just pawns in a geopolitical game of chess, but individuals who deserve a reasoned account of what is happening and why, and who might themselves have views worth sharing on the subject. Even if compliance is not the issue, Frederick Schauer has explained, giving reasons for governance decisions is still a way of showing respect for the subject and a way of opening a conversation rather than forestalling one. Mark Tushnet has made a similar point. Arguing in law, quote, expresses respect for people as reasoning and reasonable beings, which does seem an unqualified human good. In trying to justify the Syria operation under international law, the United States recognized that it owed various audiences an explanation for its conduct. It conceded that it was not entitled to attack Syria just because it had the military power to do so. It explained that its action was based on general principles that, though contested, reflected a considered view of the public good, not, for example, the president's own personal vendetta, and it acknowledged and addressed competing normative positions. Of course, many would have preferred for it not to have conducted the attack, but given that it did, its legal arguments at least informed others of what it was doing and why, and invited audiences around the globe to think about its logic, voice objections, and demand a reasoned response, including in the institution that is specifically charged with addressing such situations, the UN Security Council. The Soleimani case is again different. The Trump administration's changing and untethered justifications express not respect, but contempt for those who expected a reasoned account of what it did. If you don't think this matters, other people surely do. Take US Republican Senator Mike Lee. He called the administration's briefing to Congress, quote, insulting and demeaning for the way it tried to stifle rather than engage seriously in a reasoned discussion. To be clear, Lee's complaint was not about the legal or policy merits of the Soleimani strike. He emphasized that he supported the administration and admired what he saw as its overall restraint in dealing with Iran. His complaint was that the administration was not serious about publicly justifying its action in law. The administration's message, in Lee's words, was that, quote, we need to be good little boys and girls and not debate this in public. For Lee, that message was, and I'm quoting again here, absolutely insane, wrong, and again, insulting. Not trying to justify the action in law was a show of disrespect. Fourth, the use of Bellum's argumentative dimension helps constitute a decent global politics about some of the most contentious things that states do in the world. It enables people in disparate parts of the world to engage together on the issues that they all care about, while structuring in relatively positive ways how they engage. Again, legal arguments have a particular structure and style. The participants use the law's various resources, its texts, norms, methods, and institutions to explain how their positions are consonant with the interests or values of a group. The argument thus pushes them to grapple with the politics of the group. Those who engage in these arguments plainly disagree about which policies best promote the public good. Their disagreements at times run so deep that they cannot definitively or authoritatively be resolved, and their legal positions are almost certainly informed by their own interests or passions. Still, there is value to putting them in conversation with one another and pushing them, as Chantal Mouffe has said, to see themselves as belonging to the same political association and sharing a common symbolic space. My colleague Don Herzog explains that, quote, debate over principle, over the common good and justice is a distinctive and invaluable moment of political life. It acquires a depth and seriousness of purpose, he explains, not because it is detached from or just a cloak for the participants' own preferences, but because it involves the dissonant intertwining of principle and interests. In trying to define their own priorities in relation to the groups, the participant must in some way contend with the politics of the group. They must confront what is at stake in concrete decisions, not just for themselves, but also for others who care about the decisions. Take the US position on self-defense against non-state actors. The United States and about a dozen other states, mostly military allies of the United States, claim that states may use force in self-defense if the state from which the attack is conducted is unable or unwilling to contain the threat. This claim has spawned nearly 2 decades of debate among a broad range of actors. Although the participants have plainly been motivated by their own interests and values, they have also argued about principle. They have pushed for their priorities to be reflected in the use of Bellum's normative resources. And though the proponents of the unable or unwilling position have not much changed it as a result of the debate, their critics evidently still want to argue with them and focus the world's attention on it, rather than passively accept it as inevitable. The critics want these states to contend with, to take into account and address their opposing views. So where does all of this leave us? Well, I've claimed that arguments about the use of Bellum are not only routine, they are worthwhile. They're worthwhile even when, and as is often the case, they are not authoritatively resolved. They still help to promote certain rule of law values. They foster the expectation that sheer power is not a sufficient basis for making use of force decisions. They help to hold the people in power accountable for such decisions. They show respect for those who care about the decisions by providing a reasoned account of what is happening and why. And they foster a relatively healthy politics about some of the most devastating things that states do in the world. All things being equal, we should want global actors to engage in this argumentative practice, even when authoritative resolution is beyond reach. And in my view, the shift in the United States' approach from the 2017 Syria incident to the 2020 Soleimani one is reflective of a broader trend in the use of Bellum, especially the US relationship with it. Although US actions have long pushed or exceeded the boundaries of what the use of Bellum permits, it has also long taken seriously the use of Bellum's argumentative dimension. I think that's decreasingly the case, and that the costs to the rule of law are real. In my view, the most plausible corrective, so long as states continue to disagree about what the use of Bellum does or should prescribe, is for them to double down on the argumentative dimension, to insist that those who use military power need authority for their conduct, to demand that they provide good reasons for their decisions, to hold them accountable when their reasons fall flat, and to press them to grapple with competing perspectives. By contrast, disengaging from the use of Bellum's argumentative dimension would work to bolster the already powerful. It would mean accepting that once these states use force as they please, they need not explain or justify their decisions to the people who are affected. That alternative would be a blow to the rule of law and would, in my view, make the world, harsh as it might already be, a worse place to live. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Monica. That was great. As I said at the beginning, we were in for a very innovative and very interesting and fresh and crisp view on a perennial and so important question. I have a couple of questions lined up. Everyone else who wants to make questions can write them down in the chat channel. So the first one is, how do you see the relationship between legality and legitimacy, or between law and other normative discourse such as politics or morality in arguments about the use of force? Is there continuity between them, or are they separated? And particularly as to the kind of argument that you find in the UN Security Council, may it not be possible that states want to make political arguments without any legal authority? Is that something you consider?
Great, really getting to the heart of the issue. So I would say that the question of whether, I think just to start with your last bit of that, I think it's very possible that states might want to approve of an operation without taking a position on the law. I don't think their subjective intent of whether they are or are not, in their view, taking a position on the law is the most relevant question. I think what's relevant is how they interact with other people and manifest it, because I think law, like politics, is socially constituted. So what matters is not what's in their head, but what they actually do and how it plays out. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that although I do think one can come up with different ways to distinguish between what is law and what is politics in the abstract, I think in the context of the use of force, as in many other contexts in international law, to ask the question, is this a legal or a political question or decision, is not a particularly useful question to ask. So it's useful if what you're trying to assess is whether the action is consistent with some abstract conception of what the law is. So you look at the text of the charter and you say, like, this is what it permits, and now I take this action and I assess it against the text of the charter, and I'm sitting in my library here at the University of Michigan, and that's all I'm doing. I'm just sort of like a technician trying to do that. But if what you're trying to assess is how the law operates in the real world, what decision makers do with it, and how they do whatever they do with it, then the distinction is not, in my view, particularly useful, because what you want to know is how the law is actually going to play out. And for example, in the Syria case, the fact of the matter is that most states decided not to apply Article 2.4 to condemn what the United States did. Now, I want to, so the fact of the matter is that they instead, in the institution, again, that is charged with making use of force decisions under the jus ad bellum, they basically endorsed what the United States did. Now, you can say that's politics, but what I want to know as a lawyer is, how is the law going to play out? And so for purposes of answering that question, I think the asking, well, is it law or is it politics, is just not particularly relevant. And I actually think it's a red herring that gets in the way of a sort of a useful analysis that people in the real world might use to engage with this body of law.
Excellent. I have a connected question, which is, so you give 4 important arguments about the importance of legal argument in this field or in this area of the law. do we always have to prefer legal argumentation over political or normative discourses? Is it a good idea to translate everything into law?
Not necessarily, and not in all circumstances, in my view. But I do think legal argumentation forces a particular mode of interaction that in a world where we don't have a world where people are extraordinarily diverse in their moralities and their preferences, this mode is actually a useful way of encouraging a conversation and enabling people to interact based on some common ground, as opposed to interacting on any alternative basis. So I do think legal argumentation is extraordinarily useful for that. Now, some people will say in response, well, yeah, but legal argumentation, precisely because of its structure and style, also boxes people in and limits the available room for people who are perhaps consistently oppressed through law to sort of throw the cloak of the law off of them and to experience real emancipation. I think that sounds good in theory. I don't think it's how things work in practice. I think the alternative, for example, to pushing the United States to argue in law is not that all of a sudden other states will be emancipated from the US exercise of military power. The alternative is likely to be that the US will do what it wants with its military power without whatever constraints actually exist in law and without any need to respond to those who want to delegitimize its actions. So in my view, arguing in law actually brings real benefits, even if it also comes with some attendant costs, which are that people who are oppressed might feel like actions against them are in some sense legitimized through the operation of the law.
Excellent. I have a following question, which is coincidentally, well, I don't know whether that's entirely coincidental, but follows on quite well on what you were saying. So is the UN, or do you think the UN Security Council is, it says, it's the appropriate forum, but I would say, is it the best forum for arguments about the use of force? How about the General Assembly, and should not states, particularly from the Global South, try to push for other venues rather than one which is exclusionary and limitative, and in which they have a less of a saying?
Yes, absolutely. I think, absolutely, they should push for other venues in which to advocate for their views. And in my view, especially with this and other trends that I see in the use of Bellum, states that have historically, I would say, have sort of sat on the sidelines or been a little passive in their interactions with the use of Bellum, I think it's time for them, honestly, to step up and to engage more seriously with this body of law if they want to preserve it. And as you say, the Security Council might not always be the best place to do that. So other institutions that can serve to reinforce certain positions precisely because they have authority, even if not formally binding authority. And in this case, I'm talking in particular about the General Assembly, which of course, under the UN Charter, does not actually have authority to adopt binding decisions. But we all know that General Assembly resolutions are often viewed as, in some sense, authoritative. And so I would very much encourage states of the Global South to push for their positions in the General Assembly, in the non-aligned movement, even if it's not a universal body, which they sometimes have, and in other fora in which they can assert, like, we don't agree necessarily with everything, with all the positions that, NATO states, for example, take on the use of force.
Excellent. And following up very quickly on this, what do you see the role of the International Court of Justice playing in this conversation? I mean, you said a little bit in your lecture, but perhaps you could expand a bit.
I think the International Court of Justice is potentially a useful venue. I think it's too bad that it has been sort of checked out since 2005 ish on the main issues that are the main contests on the use of Bellum. But I also think the International Court of Justice is not the best institution to push back against the claims that people find offensive. And the reason I think that is because it's a court and it has to be very careful about how it makes decisions. And it's very careful, as we know that it's a conservative court, and it often does not want to be in the position of articulating normative positions that will then be ignored on the ground. And I'm not sure that it's right to expect the International Court of Justice to finally resolve the content of the law. It's not a democratically representative body by any means. I think the better way to define the content of the law is to have states engage with it more, and to accept that the content of the law might not always be crystallizable in very clear and precise rules, and to say, yeah, that's part of the game, but it's still worth arguing about it, rather than expecting this court in The Hague to save us.
Not that it matters much, but I totally agree with you on that.
It does matter.
Well, are there any substantive conclusions we can draw about the law on the use of force, about arguments before the UN Security Council? Is it appropriate to extract or to infer substantive conclusions? Can you reach, or can we reach any conclusions, for instance, on the unwilling or unable doctrine?
So I think the question is probably making reference to two Security Council resolutions that seemed to, but did not explicitly recognize that defensive force against non-state actors might in some circumstances be lawful. One resolution that came down right after the 9/11 attacks, and the other in response to ISIS's control of large swaths of territory in Syria. And in both cases, the Security Council actually did not articulate a position on self-defense, although it seemed to condone the relevant operations that were taken in response to the acts by non-state actors. I think the ambiguity reflects a disinterest in trying to resolve once and for all, or an incapacity to try to resolve once and for all the content of the law. And so I guess in an ideal world, if we might want more clarity in this area, but I don't think the Security Council, at least not in the near term, is likely to provide it. So I think whether we like it or not, we're stuck with quite a bit of ambiguity on the precise contours of the right to use force in self-defense. And then the question is, well, what do we do with that ambiguity? And I think the view of some is, well, we should just, check out, or it's not worth arguing. We're never going to get what we want. And I think that's the wrong response.
So you mentioned the trend that has advanced after 2017. Do you think that this new trend will reproduce itself in the next few years, or could it be modified with changes in the presidential administration this year or sometime?
Well, I mean, as you'll note, I used two examples from the Trump administration. I think the Trump administration, so both the 2017 Syria incident and the 2020 Soleimani one, were done under President Trump. And in one case, I think the United States basically engaged with international law as it historically has, where it has deviated from the black letter of the law. And in another, it really sort of disengaged from it. I think a Biden administration is likely to be likely to revert a little bit more to the former. Although I think a Biden administration is likely to face many of the same perceived security threats that a Trump administration faces. And so in content, I don't know if that there's going to be that much different between the positions that the Trump administration seems to be implementing and the positions that the Obama administration, for example, articulated.
Great. We had a follow-up question about whether you think re-election of Trump would have any implications on this, but I think you may want to add something to that, or leave it at what you just said.
Well, in my view, I'll just say this other thing. In my view, the biggest threat from the Trump administration to international law is an overall disengagement, an effort to undercut, again, its authority. It's not necessarily particular actions that are inconsistent with the content of the law, because I think there is quite a bit of continuity in U.S. foreign policy, despite all the chaos. And the chaos is the disengagement, and it's the same thing domestically as it is internationally. It's a constant suggestion that law's authority is not particularly relevant to how the US government makes decisions, whether we're speaking about domestic law or international law.
Do you see that as an isolated phenomenon regarding the US, or a more extended trend, for instance, in the UK recently, or Russia, China?
I think it's a more extensive trend. I think, and I think it's troubling for that reason. For example, I think the fact that very few states push back on the Soleimani incident using, again, the language of the law is troubling. I think we've seen an increased willingness to openly engage in what seem to be territorial acquisitions by show or use of force. So, India has recently taken actions in Kashmir. Turkey has acted in northern Syria. And so there are what's happening right now between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Azerbaijan is essentially on the offensive to reclaim contested territory. So, and not really using legal justifications for these actions, which go to the very heart of Article 2.4, because they concern efforts to acquire territory by force. So I think that trend is troubling, and I think it's reflective of a broader level of disengagement. On the other hand, there have been efforts by some states to try to push states to more seriously contend with and engage with international law. So, and the use of force, and the law and the use of force in particular. So, a couple of years ago, now it's more than a couple of years ago, maybe 5 years ago, Brazil put out a unilateral position on its position on the use of Bellum, and particularly resisted the idea that states may use defensive force against non-state actors. France, although seeming to be on board with the idea that states may, at least in some circumstances, use self-defense against non-state actors, because after all, that's what it did against ISIS in Syria, later came out with a position saying, well, yeah, that's almost never the case. It didn't explain exactly how to mesh the two. There have been efforts to try to get the General Assembly more engaged, the Security Council more engaged. So I think there are efforts to engage more seriously with this body of law, but there are also very strong counter trends that push against it.
Excellent. Do you think one way of reading of what you're trying to do is to take international law out of legal experts, International Law Commission, the International Court of Justice, and bring it back to politics? So bring international law back to the states, back to political argumentation, to political fora. Do you, at any rate, sort of identify with that description, or not necessarily?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it goes back to your first question you asked me about what I view as the relationship between law and politics. And so I think there's still a role for legal experts here. But I think the role for legal experts, at least in this context, is not to constantly try to define what the proper or real content of the law is, but instead to engage with the debate and to help people understand and navigate the legal terrain that we actually confront, which is not one of to help people use the law in those spaces. And I think we don't do that enough. That's sort of what's motivating this.
Okay.
Am I coming through? I see that my connection is unstable.
Yeah, you're coming through perfectly. I'm not sure I'm coming through perfectly, but
yeah, you are.
I mean, I'm understanding everything. So hopefully we'll hear from the audience if something's not working entirely well. So I have a completely separate question. Do you make any distinction between arguments about interpretation of the current law and arguments about that could contribute to amendments of the law? So the lege lata and lege ferenda, I think, distinction. Trying to legally justify uses of force that would otherwise be illegal. Is that something you concentrate on?
It's not something that I myself concentrate on. The reason why is that I think it reflects, again, a distinction between that which is clearly law and that which is not yet law. And I think that distinction is often blurred in practice. And so it's not a distinction that I particularly focus on, but I do think it's the case that the law can change in response to efforts to push it in particular directions. And this, again, goes back to something I said earlier. I think one thing that's concerning about the way in which many states have responded to, for example, operations that are taken in purported self-defense under the unable or unwilling standard, is that more often than not, most of the rest of the world, when those operations are conducted and endorsed by a small handful of states, more often than not, the rest of the states do nothing in response. And so long as they do nothing, I think, again, you might say like, well, they're, actually, so long as they do, what I was going to say is, so long as they do nothing, the law that people are actually using and applying is actually moving, in my view. I say this with, again, a definition of law that is operationally as well as normatively relevant, not just what exists in the law books out in the ether. Now, I will just say one thing. Someone has recently said, Hakimi is too willing to treat states' ambivalence or silence in response to specific acts as acquiescence. I don't actually take it as acquiescence. What I take it as is disengagement. But the law is created and engaged with by the participants who are in the game. And so disengagement, in my view, is still destructive to the law, to any position that the people who are disengaged think is law, because that which is being made operational and being legitimized in legal terms is that which is actually in the hands of those who are participating. So again, this goes back to what I was saying about, I don't think it's really an option anymore for states to just say like, oh, well, I'm fine, I don't need to engage, because the law is firmly established in the books, so long as I just every 10 years burp up a comment that says I endorse a restrictive position on the charter. I just think that's not enough anymore. And so I think the law is moving, no matter whether those states like it or not. Now, I'll say one other thing. I'm very cognizant of the fact that many states don't have the resources to attend to these issues. But I would say that what that means is that the rest of us, so the UN is an enormous organization, civil society groups, ought to help them engage more seriously if they don't have the resources in their foreign ministries and ministries of defense to constantly pay attention to what's happening and to take on these issues. So it's just that the shift of attention, I think, the attention should shift from let's just clarify the rules and just tinker, like here we are with the charter text and we can just keep clarifying the rules, to no, let's actually help people who disagree with the law as it's being applied push in the direction that they would prefer. Now, they might not win, but at the very least, they can delegitimize or avoid legitimizing operations with which they disagree. So I think that contest is very healthy, and it's something that lawyers should focus more on.
Excellent. I also totally agree with that position about states taking a more active role in this kind of debates, and about academic, civil society, and the UN helping them do that. You referred in several parts of your talk to international law in practice, and my question is, to what extent that limits your normative thinking in this area of the law? How far are you going to concede to existing practices in terms of thinking about what international law should look like in this area?
Well, I have very strong views normatively, but I personally don't think it's my job as a scholar. And I know this is not to criticize those who do make this their job as scholars or analysts, to like tell the world what the law in this area ought to look like. That's not my particular project. Again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that project. It's just not mine. My project is to try to tell them, look, the world is extraordinarily pluralistic. States have very different, competing, often inconsistent views on what the law and the use of force ought to look like. Given that, here's how you navigate this space. So that's my project. Now, it might, so I don't think, so it's true that it might limit the question you're asking. My refusal to engage more seriously with the normative underpinnings of particular operations or what the use of force ought to look like might limit the normative punch of my scholarly agenda. But I just don't think like my vision of the law is very useful, or my vision of the ideal is very useful in the world. There are lots of people who have lots of ideals that don't look like the reality. And so what I want to do is try to help people who disagree with this reality and who actually are in the position to change it, figure out how to do that.
Okay, I think many students in the audience, one of them is asking, I assume, what's your view on the unwilling standard?
My view on the unwilling or unable standard is that it is extraordinarily broad, and as applied and articulated, it leaves too much discretion in the hands of the state that claims to be acting in self-defense to decide for itself whether a particular operation is permissible. And so I personally think that that standard reflects a massive push to decentralize authority away from the council to individual states who want to decide on in their own discretion to use force. And so I think it's too expansive. Now, having said that, I also recognize that it's very, very difficult to define in the abstract what the right standard ought to be once you accept that states ought to be able to respond to at least some forcible operations by non-state actors. And my view is that they should be able to respond to at least some forcible operations by non-state actors, but it's untenable to expect states not to respond when the territorial state is itself objectively speaking, and again, what does it mean to be objectively speaking? Just like incapable of dealing with the problem. So in my view, actually, the sort of best way to deal with this problem is to get the Security Council more actively involved in making case-specific decisions, as it did in the ISIS scenario. It can't happen in every single case, but I think the Security Council is a real venue for saying, in cases like ISIS, as it did, or in cases like the Al-Qaeda attacks on the United States after the September 11th, on September 11th, 2001, to say, okay, yeah, this one we're basically signing off on. We're not giving you a theory on how it's lawful. We're not actually even saying that it is, but we are communicating that we're okay with this. And so I think that's a useful mechanism for dealing with major operations against non-state actors, as the one in Afghanistan and the one in Syria and Iraq were. And then I think another useful mechanism, and this is a mechanism that actually most states that invoke the unable or unwilling standard themselves rely on more often than not, is to expect those states to work with the territorial state and to obtain the relevant government's consent for their operations in its territory. So I think the unable or unwilling standard is extreme, and I think it's extreme even to states that invoke it, and that's why they more often than not, and they reflect a strong preference for obtaining the consent of the territorial state. And I think there needs to be a mechanism, and here's where I brought in the Security Council, to try to manage the circumstances where the territorial state is not willing to consent, as Afghanistan presumably was not, and the Assad government was really not.
This comes to what we've talked about, or you've talked about. I think it's an interesting question to see. So, what do you think is the remnant or the role that the ICJ can still play in these kind of conversations? Because you seem to suggest that to express a strong preference. Can you hear me well? You seem to suggest a strong preference for discussing these issues in a more particularistic or more particular context of the Security Council. So what role is left for the ICJ?
I think there's actually a huge role for the ICJ. As I said, I think ICJ decisions have been extremely influential, even though maybe because they are so cryptic in their content and often open to multiple conflicting interpretations. And I think the reason that might be actually a very good use of its time and energy and position to basically define the contours within which states might act, or to sort of hint in particular directions that might make might make the extreme positions implausible, and then create space for states to argue in between those extremes. So I think the ICJ can still play a very useful role, but I don't think we can expect the ICJ to resolve each and every question that is going to come up, for example, in the context of self-defense against non-state actors. I think it's untenable to ask the ICJ to articulate a general standard that will apply across the board in all circumstances. And it's untenable for the reasons I just mentioned, because it's very hard to figure out what that standard ought to be once you accept, and not everyone does, but once you accept, but the Security Council seems to, once you accept that at least some such operations ought to be acceptable. Now, Alejandro checked out for a minute, so I will just, I see that our time is up, and I'm sure he has an emergency on his end. I don't want to keep you for longer than necessary, so I will just say to everyone, as well as to Alejandro, that
I'm back.
Oh, good. I was about to thank you.
I should thank you, in fact. I think we have 3 more minutes. I want to just ask you one more question. Has nothing to do with, well, nothing to do. So any advice for international lawyers from the global south? Anything? I mean, there are lots of students, as I said, and young lawyers in the audience. Perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think now is. Oh, sorry. I think now is a really exciting opportunity, actually, for young lawyers from the global south, because I think maybe unlike even like 5 to 7 years ago, I think there is increasingly a recognition among Anglo and European international lawyers who have maybe dominated at least their own internal scene for a very, very long time, that their internal scene is too limited, and that they need to hear more voices from people who are not within their own circle. So I think now is a really exciting time, actually, for lawyers from the global south. I think there are lots of opportunities. I think the geopolitical space is changing, and with that, international law is also going to have to adapt, because of course it's a product of the political context in which it's created, and as any law is. And so I think it's a time for people from the global south, the international lawyers from the global south, really to make their mark. At least they have been making their mark, I know, up till now, but make their mark more on the thinking of international lawyers in the global north.
Thank you so much.
That's not very concrete advice, but it's like it's encouragement.
It is. I think it's relations and more conversations. So we are very, very grateful to you for a magnificent talk and for great Q&A. Thank you so much. And for the rest of us, we see each other in the next session for the Dialogues of International Law. More information will be with you in a minute. Thank you so much, Monica.
Thank you so much. Everyone. It's really been delightful being here.